Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We focus on theories of everything from the past that have the potential to help you out in your own life. With your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better physical, mental, and spiritual health. And we focus on obscure works that most people haven't heard of, and also, like theories of everything, grand unified theories, things that somebody spent their whole life, or at least, a couple decades of their life working on and putting it together and kind of trying to get it into the best shape possible to present to an audience, but that audience has not been forthcoming in general. Today is our 90-second video that we have done on the book called Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha from Daniel Ingram. And I don't consider this to be a book on religion, but rather a book on science. The science of meditation in particular, both concentration meditation on an object and insight meditation into the three characteristics of all phenomena. The characteristic of impermanence, the characteristic of unsatisfactoriness or dissatisfactoriness or suffering, and the characteristic of no self. All of our mental and physical sensations have these characteristics, and as we figure that out, we become better at detecting it, and we motivate ourselves around the cycle of insight, enlightening ourselves by degrees. And Ingram has spent a lot of time meditation retreats all over the world, but especially in the Far East, and has conferred with many of the custodians of that tradition, as well as books from that tradition, and has kind of put a bow on it and put it on a silver platter and given it to us in English. We're unlikely to get a source this comprehensive that is clearly written in our modern English at this point. And we are about to start chapter 60, which is more in the autobiographical section of the book. And he's talking about many of the, I believe, psychic powers, acquiring psychic powers, which he kind of got into as an anagami after getting through 3 insight cycles, but not hit the 4th, or the 4th was a question mark. And I guess he felt like balancing himself out a little bit. And so he talks about magic with a K, and things like Kabbalah, Tree of Life, and sacred geometry. We'll see what he has to say here. Paradigm fluency. One of the most essential concepts related to thinking about the powers and so many other things is the ability to have a general sense of which paradigmatic framework you are using and recognize its pros and cons, so that you can, for each changing experience and situation, determine the most useful frameworks to bring to bear to meet your various needs and goals. It is often useful to shift which framework you are using in order to be successful at various endeavors, and even to use frameworks in close temporal proximity to each other, which are apparently contradictory. For those who are into the powers and want to do a little fun reading, I recommend checking out the relatively new system of chaos magic, specifically the classic short book Condensed Chaos by Phil Hine, Hine, which is a wonderful treatment of how to embrace a pragmatic fluidity of perspective. For example, scientific materialism is a common framework that people use when dealing with various scientific problems. I personally use a modified version of this framework all the time in the emergency department. In medicine, the sciences of biology, physics, and chemistry are some of the essential foundations upon which we base diagnosis and treatment. However, it is certainly not the only useful framework for working in that environment. Biology, physics, and chemistry are chunky frameworks when dealing with much of what happens in human minds and hearts, as well as in interpersonal relationships, families, and communities. Further, the belief structures of everyone involved, including treatment providers, play a large role in making or breaking an encounter with a patient and their family. The world of beliefs and human interactions, as well as their effects on health outcomes, are not easy to quantify in terms of biology, physics, and chemistry. Try talking about the meaning of a dream you had or some intuition strictly in terms of biology, chemistry, and physics, and see how that goes. Try using only those frameworks next time you go out on a romantic dinner or hang out with good friends. It's not going to be the loads of fun that strict scientific materialists would have you believe. And in engineering and mathematics, add in engineering and mathematics, and you still aren't going to be having much of a party. The Star Trek character Spock is funny for a reason, but only to a point. These same problems that arise from clinging to a rigid materialist paradigm apply to dealing with the experiences of powers. Further, we all have myths and magical aspects to our thinking, and pretending otherwise just creates shadow sides. Despite what some of you might think of yourselves, nobody is purely rational, since nobody is purely rational since, were people rational, scientific materialism would rapidly be seen as limited and irrational by scientific materialists themselves, for example. This rarely happens, which is too bad. Archetypes and symbols play a significant role in our lives, whether we admit it or not. Symbols can have huge conscious and subconscious meanings and effects. Advertisers know this all too well. We sense things at many levels of which we are barely conscious, and process things in ways we can only guess at. Intuition, gut feelings, and snap judgments are a huge part of our everyday decision making. Very complex emotional energies that we may be skilled at recognizing and accepting can influence countless decisions. Shadow sides abound. As anyone who does mental health work or deep introspection will tell you, it is a strange and murky world within us, and that strange and murky world can have lots of real world implications for our psychological and physical health, as well as impact our functioning in jobs, relationships, and the like. Looking for some fun reading about how our internal world can sculpt our physical reality? Check out the mainstream scientific literature on medical conditions like conversion disorder, stigmata, and fictitious pregnancy. Even more fun, check out The Intention Experiment by Lynn McTaggart, The End of Materialism by Charles Tart, and The Sense of Being Stared At by Rupert Sheldrake. All good times. Sometimes we can really benefit from being willing to jump into a paradigm that allows us to work on this totally different level, a level whose causality may seem mysterious, but is yet extremely and deeply human. Strict, dogmatic, hyper-rational rigidity, idealized materialism is ill-suited to much of that work and can seriously impair our ability to be with what is actually going on. It is simply too narrow in its bandwidth, and I am being polite here. What I really mean to say is that imposing the taboos that come out of scientific materialism onto phenomena as amazing, fascinating, compelling, profound, useful, revealing, awesome, and potentially healing as the powers is one of the greater paradigmatic crimes of the last 1,000 years. By failing to be willing to sometimes adapt a way of working with our hearts, minds, and bodies that embraces or at least acknowledges the world of embarrassing emotions, deep desires, irrational thought patterns, uncomfortable associations, archetypal energies, and all the oddities of this human mind and body in its full and bizarre glory, we may miss many opportunities for insight, healing, growth, and empowerment. In short, practically speaking, there is much to be said for being able to adopt frameworks for working with much of that when it makes sense to do so. And magical frameworks are some of the frameworks that can function well in those contexts. Remember the example of the strong practitioner who rose through the formless realms and came out and then traveled out of body and gained insights into her big issue as the thing played out in mythic form in the chapter From Content to Insight. This is the sort of insight that can be helpful and healing, and which we may have a harder time accessing if we don't make room for paradigms that might initially seem odd or even crazy. Just because we may go there at times doesn't mean we live there all the time. And the real skill is discerning which paradigm would work optimally in which situation. For instance, you might have just come back from a retreat where you were playing around with visualization abilities, and a few days later you see a troop of radiant angels floating through the walls and into your living room where you are entertaining guests. This was your actual causal experience, questions of reality aside. Whether you choose to ignore the angels, give them lots of attention, mention them to your guests, get down on your knees and begin praying, or run screaming out the door and check yourself into a mental facility will have different implications for your actual life. These implications should be carefully considered when conducting yourself in the face of such experiences. Obviously, in nearly all cases, not reacting in any way that is going to freak out those around you is recommended, though mentioning that you saw such things to someone who can skillfully handle that information is often a good idea. On a side note, if you have learned to see angels, you will probably run into devils soon enough. Okay, this chapter is called Crazy. Finally, we have the slippery question of mental illness. In addition to the powers sometimes causing people who have not adequately trained in morality to behave like assholes, the powers can also lead to people getting really, really weird. It is not always easy to distinguish conditions like schizophrenia, a transient psychotic episode, or bipolar with psychotic features from the side effects of strong concentration and natural talent. Further, if you want to get to know about your shadow side, the powers are a crash course. While Buddhist while Buddhism has its own take on delusions and mental afflictions, for this section I'm going to wax Western psychological. For instance, it might be very educational to have your relationship issues with your parents manifest as two large, slobbering demons who hurl flaming stuffed animals at you while you are traveling out of body on your way to the Grand Canyon. But it can often take lots of time and reflection to figure out how these sorts of experiences make a practical difference in our lives. That is the easy stuff. The problem comes when the effects of the powers don't let up even when you stop practicing and are trying to function in the ordinary world. This is when it is time to connect with people who can help stabilize you until the destabilizing effects calm down or resolve, assuming they will, which is not always the case. Strong insight and concentration practice, even when that practice wasn't dedicated to the powers, can make people go temporarily or permanently, or for the rest of that lifetime, psychotic. The more the practice involves creating experiences that diverge significantly from what I will crudely term consensus reality, and the longer one engages in those practices, the more likely prolonged difficulties are. It is of note that a significant number of the primary propagators of Western magical traditions became moderately nuts towards the ends of their lives. As one Burmese man said to Kenneth, "My brother does concentration practice. You know, sometimes they go a little mad." He was talking about what can sometimes happen when people get into the powers. Remember, many of these experiences are enough grounds for a diagnosis of mental illness in the conventional medical world. So seek the guidance of those who simultaneously appear to be quite sane and functional, who also actually know how to navigate skillfully in this territory. Finding these qualified people is difficult but well worth the effort. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders does give some wiggle room for expected, accepted, altered states and experiences that happen in a standard religious or spiritual context. Pentecostals speaking in tongues is a good example, but we should be wary of using that wiggle room too readily if our level of functioning in the ordinary world has suddenly dropped, as something more serious may be going on. To use the example of the Pentecostals again, they tend to manifest gifts of the Spirit, such as speaking in tongues in church, where that is considered normal. But then at their workplace, they may act just like everyone else, meaning they can turn it on and shut it off. That's really the key point, to bring this into a more meditative context. If you have learned to visualize, say, a tantric deity, and that deity sometimes appears to interact with you when you are doing formal practices, that is not necessarily crazy unless the deity starts telling you to do something harmful and you start to take that seriously. That's obviously a whole different situation and requires help immediately. Then there are effects that persist in the world when you stop practicing. If you find that you are still acting strangely or perceiving the world oddly, such as hearing voices that are telling you to do things, particularly harmful things or things that would disturb you and others, seeing frightening shadows, demons, or dead people around you that you think might be real, being paranoid, getting odd reactions from those around you that you can't explain, becoming obsessive about strange things. I had a competent meditator friend of mine who got temporarily fascinated by everything that was yellow, for example. Having people say they are worried about you, living in a clearly altered universe, and the like, I strongly recommend that you talk with a professional. Professional at what? There are many and varied opinions on how meditative practice relates to mental illness, and it is likely vastly more complicated than any of us appreciates at this point. The science of this is currently in its infancy. I know those who are certain that strong practice made someone they know or themselves mentally ill. I also find entire online communities of those with mental illnesses, such as the Icarus Project, where you can find members who feel they have benefited from the stabilizing effects of practice. Thus, at this point, it appears to go both ways. There is a reason that many meditation centers have questionnaires about physical and mental history, previous and current medications, psychiatric diagnoses, and the like, as they know that those who are less stable don't always do well when things get weirder or their concentration gets ramped up. Some of my bipolar and schizophrenic friends who meditate have strongly encouraged me to include something that says to avoid the high intensity techniques that I present here, to keep things more grounded in physical activities or somatic practices, to use much lower doses of meditation, to practice very gently and avoid visualization and mantra practice unless you are working very closely with a qualified teacher, being physically ungrounded, practicing frequently and intensely, and doing visualization and mantra practices without qualified guidance can increase the risks of meditation practice going wrong. You can find lots of information of varying quality about these topics on the internet. If you are worried about the effects of practice in your mental health for whatever reason, check around, start slowly, avoid extreme changes, and keep in the loop someone who is qualified to help manage this sort of practice. Even if you are a strong practitioner, if you are doing high intensity practicing, there is lots to be said for having friends around with whom you can talk if you start to feel you are getting too far out there. That said, there are clearly those who once were sane and healthy who have flipped out when they started practicing hard, and it is an obvious myth that you must have something wrong with you to have these practices precipitate a psychotic, manic, or depressive episode. The practicing hard part is more a question of probabilities. Unfortunately, as we get more data, it becomes clear that these experiences can also happen to previously very sane, functional, ordinary people who practiced at doses that I would have previously considered nearly homeopathic. This is something that many of the people teaching them, such as social workers and clinical psychologists offering mindfulness-based therapies and meditative practices, are often entirely unprepared for, which is a truly ironic situation. It is sort of like an asymptotic curve where the tail never quite touches zero, meaning that we can't promise that any dose is necessarily 100 million% safe. Though there is clear dose dependency of side effects, not many people, but for many people, but not all. Those interested in the science of these unfortunate effects should check out the work of Dr. Willoughby Britton and Dr. Jared Lindahl. This section is the package insert with the fine print that is telling you all the bad stuff that can happen. As a hopefully rational person with what I hope is good decision-making capacity, you can choose to get into this stuff or not. And if you get into it, decide how you wish to push it. One day, hopefully, we will have a good predictive criteria of who is at higher risk for negative side effects, know vastly more about how to prevent them, and address situations skillfully when they occur, at the same time as allowing people to make good progress to develop the mental skill sets they wish to develop. I would bet that those with the best morality practice will do better, but it is clearly no guarantee that bad things won't happen in meditation, as I know some extremely moral, kind, previously quite sane, balanced, and functional people who lost it on the cushion and thereafter for some period. In the meantime, realize that meditation, like any other aspect of the phenomenal world, is not perfectly safe. Anyone who says otherwise is selling something or just doesn't know what they're talking about. Aside from the question of genuine mental illness and temporary psychosis, tinkering with visions and other extraordinary experiences such as traveling out of body, by location, etc., can sometimes cause us to feel ungrounded, disconnected, otherworldly, and scattered for hours or even days afterwards, something I call city hangover. For those who have experienced the effects of strong hallucinogens, it is very much like the post-trip integration phase that can last for days or much longer. Exercise and focusing on anything physical can help with this, as well as just tending to simple daily routine tasks like paying bills, volunteer service in a soup kitchen, or sweeping the floor. I would suggest care and caution in dealing with all the visions and other unusual experiences that might arise in practice. The primary danger is taking them too seriously and thus assuming they are more important than they really are. It may be a good idea to leave them until very late in our practice, unless we have someone around to guide us through their skillful use, or unless we are quite balanced and have been for a significant amount of time and have a good sense of humor about them. If not, they can very easily magnify our less desirable aspects and only serve as long psychedelic and manipulative tunnels to nowhere or to destruction. I remember a letter from a friend who was on a long retreat in Burma and was supposed to be doing insight practices but had slipped into playing with these sorts of experiences. He was now fascinated by his ability to see spirit animals and other supernormal beings and was having regular conversations with some sort of low-level god that kept telling him that he was making excellent progress in his insight practice. That is exactly what he wanted to hear. However, the fact that he was having stable visionary experiences and was buying into their content made it abundantly clear that he wasn't doing insight practices at all, but was lost in and being fooled by these. Don't get me wrong, if we are looking for another way to address our content and issues, visions of things like spirit animals can be helpful, particularly in the right cultural context. But it's crucial not to mix up content and fundamental insight. It is also worth noting, as my friend wished me to point out in this volume, that after a few days of this, he realized that the demigod wasn't giving him useful advice, and so he started ignoring it and went away, and he got back to insight practices. Speaking of crazy, which I realize is not the most professional of terms, but bear with me here, I realize that good old Siggy Freud and its definition of mental illness, which is those things that interfere with love and work. As an emergency medicine physician, spent a lot of time taking care of people who have various mental illnesses, with the most common being anxiety, depression, sometimes with psychotic features, the personality disorders, substance abuse and dependence, bipolar disorder, and the schizophrenia spectrum disorders. A reasonable number of patients have experiences that might be classified as falling into the powers category, such as auditory and visual hallucinations, as well as various experiences such as the sense of thought insertion and the like. So how do these individual experience differ from those of the practicing meditator, and should they be conceptualized and managed differently? Okay, one more paragraph, I think. These are important questions, and they deserve much attention. Distinguishing between meditation side effects and mental illness is sometimes easy, and at other times quite difficult. Deciding what treatment might be best is also not always straightforward. I will do a very basic discussion of it here, but it is a very complex topic that deserves much more study and research. Being a pragmatic, contemplative at heart, I tend strongly towards placing emphasis on functionality. On one end of a hypothetical spectrum, we have people who are overtly psychotic and have profound impairment in their ability to deal with reality, stay safe, and interact safely with others. This can happen to people with mental illness and to meditators. In that moment, whether if the symptoms result from meditation side effects, a mixed depressive, more a manic bipolar episode, or the beginning of schizophrenia, for example, is not as important as immediate stabilization, which means immediate emergency psychiatric medical treatment. Even if the crisis was just some meditation-induced episode, that is not likely to recur. Getting through the short term with everyone remaining unharmed is the first order of business. Okay, that's going to do it for today. Thanks for tuning in today. We'll resume tomorrow right here. And